This is an interview with Professor Alexander Rattray at the University of Manitoba. The date is April 20th, 1994, and we're in Winnipeg. Good morning. Can I call you Al?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Good morning, Al. How are you?
I'm well.
Good. And it's a nice, sunny, bright day in Winnipeg. Not too much wind today, thank goodness.
Well, we're getting ready for our few days of summer, I suppose.
That's right. Thank you very much for agreeing to take time to talk with me this morning about the profession of landscape architecture in Canada and your role, which has been a very significant one in that profession. Could we begin with, please, a little bit of information about you, your background, where you were born and when?
Born in Winnipeg in 1933.
On the 13th of June.
That's right. That's right.
Good. And you went to school here in Winnipeg?
Yeah. My early education and through to my first university degree was completed in Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm. And the first degree was here?
Yeah, I completed my Bachelor of Architecture degree at the University of Manitoba in the late 50s. Worked in an architectural office both here and in northern Manitoba in fact, ran a branch office of an architectural firm, for an architectural firm in northern Manitoba. And during that year, explored the possibilities for graduate work in landscape architecture, and then, as you will know, was accepted for graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. That was 59 to 61, I think.
Uh-huh. Who were some of the people you studied with there?
Well, I suppose the key influence there would have been Ian McHarg. To my mind, something of a giant in the United States at that time, and clearly, I think, has had a major influence on landscape architectural theory and practice in North America and beyond. Certainly in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s. I should say, though, just before we get into that, there's one other individual before I got to Penn that I think was of some importance, and that's the dean at this university, somebody who you may know of at least. That was John A. Russell. Mm-hmm. And the importance there, I think, is simply a man who had the skill to draw the best from others, and I found that as a student and then subsequently as a professional something of major importance. Mm-hmm. But then I guess we should get on to education and professional work in the United States.
Just continuing on with Ian McHarg, when you said that he did have somewhat of a national and international reputation, when I interviewed Reinhard Petersman in Halifax, he mentioned knowing of Ian McHarg's work at school in Germany. So he certainly...
It's interesting. I wasn't aware of that, but knew from some of my other later experiences in Scotland, Australia, and some other parts of the world that clearly he'd had an influence, I think, and an impact on, again, both the theoretical and practical application of those theories. Mm-hmm. in landscape architecture internationally. There were others at Penn at that time, and I was just an incredibly fortunate young person to have had an opportunity to work in the environment at Penn in the early 60s. There were people like Lou Kahn, Aldo Jurgala, Venturi was teaching at that time. Denise Scott Brown was a classmate in planning when I was in landscape architecture. Louis Mumford was the provost, as I recall it, at that time. I took some coursework with him. And then Carl Lynn, who at that time would have, I think, have been seen as one of America's more important landscape architects. He'd come at that point, I think most recently been in New York, and I worked with him in a studio situation for much of my time at Penn. And another one that comes to mind, I think of some major significance to me at least, was Alde van Eyck, the architect, but more than that, I think just environmental designer from the Netherlands, who I worked with there in, I guess it would have been 60 or 61.
Of those people, are there any ones whose design philosophy you would like to talk about, whose design philosophy influenced the way you look at landscape architecture?
Well, probably again, it would have been Ian McHarg, and I'm mindful of some of the more recent writings of people like Sutherland Lyle and others on the subject. But I think, nonetheless, McHarg's overview, ability to synthesize from a number of disciplines and bring together, I think, a new vision of at least one aspect of landscape architectural theory and practice was of critical importance to landscape architecture at this point, that is in the 1960s. I think of any of those, I mean, clearly people like Lou Kahn, Jurgula, some of the others that I'd mentioned, Carl Lynn and others couldn't help but have an impact on my thinking and my views. But I think at that point, at least, that is the time when I was doing my graduate work, McHarg's vision of landscape architecture in the future, embracing that larger scale, the relationship of natural systems to form making and all of that, were of major importance to my thinking at the time. Both in terms of practice, which I did for a while, and also then, perhaps more importantly, in terms of education.
Mm-hmm. When you said his concept of natural systems to form making, what does that mean? Can you give me an example of that?
I mean, McHarg, I guess, not the first, but the most articulate spokesman for a position in the early 60s through until fairly recently, who had argued that physical form, that is, that which we call design, that did not incorporate or embrace basic natural processes, which it seems he would argue, and I think we'd be hard-pressed not to agree with it. I want to use the word different than control, but at least affect all living systems, and not to acknowledge that and to incorporate that within the design process per se, at whatever scale, by the way. This can be at the regional scale or literally the backyard. At any scale, would be sheer folly. And I think my view would be, not all of it, but much of the work going on, even after, in this period, in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, when McHarg began to speak out, had forgotten, at least, that was of some importance. So I think what McHarg does in part, for me at least, obviously I can't speak for others, but for me at least, was to kind of reconnect post-war landscape architecture with the most important part of its heritage in America, and that would have been the work of Olmsted in the latter part of the last century. And coupled with that, I think, when I think about it now, I think of Olmsted's work in the latter part of the 19th century as carving out or staking out the scope of a profession, of the profession. And my view of history early in the 20th century, at least, others might not support this, but would be that much of that, the strength of that and the discipline associated with that vision of landscape architecture tended to be lost. And I think it's people like McHarg who contribute to the reestablishment of an exciting scope and vision of landscape architecture for the second half of the 20th century. Now, there are other people at other scales that I think have played a terribly significant role in this, and I'm not trying to suggest this was all on McHarg's back. Clearly, that's not the case. One of McHarg's, I think McHarg was effective in part, though, because he is such an effective spokesperson. Mm-hmm. And I think in that sense, when I think of some of the others that clearly influenced scope and quality of landscape architectural work in America in the period that I would be most familiar with, that is 60s and after, McHarg's, one of his particular contributions is simply his effectiveness as a spokesperson, and that I think, I mean, to be in a position where he could be speaking with either the president or the wife of the president of the United States. I mean, we make jokes about this sort of thing, but I think that's important. I mean, he's then in a position of influence, and in that sense can have a very important impact on the profession. I mean, that would have been true of Nash, the landscape architect in the 1800s in Britain. It certainly was true of Olmsted. Mm-hmm. And as you go back in history, I think you find those that are effective spokesmen that can communicate in written form as well effectively. And in addition, then are clearly doing work of quality. It's those that have had the major impact. And I think in that sense, McHarg is one of those of our time who deserves to be recognized as having made an important impact, has influenced in an important way the work of the theory and practice of landscape architecture.
Mm-hmm. Do you consider that the education that you had was very American in terms of its philosophical approach?
No, not at all. Not at all. In retrospect, I think one of the most exciting things about that. See, I didn't understand any of this. I was just a young kid from the prairies, literally, and kind of almost by accident fell into Penn. I'd made inquiries at both Harvard and Penn, and I've told the story to others. Harvard sent me 5 pounds of forms to fill out, and Ian McHarg sent me a 1-page letter that began, "Dear Alex," and for a little guy from the prairies, that was a very, for me, an important introduction to McHarg and to that school. I've not forgotten that, by the way. And that's not a criticism of Harvard, obviously. They've done some important things at that school. And I want to speak a little bit afterwards about Hideo Sasaki, who I have enormous respect for and has influenced, I think, not my professional work, but certainly my position educationally. I hope more than a little. But back to the question, and here we got to stop for a minute because I've lost track of where we are.
Just the whether or not your education was American.
Oh, no. I mean, the important thing I think at Penn at that time was certainly McHarg and Mumford and Lucan, the others that I was exposed to, I, in retrospect, would see as having attempted to address some universal issues. And furthermore, the colleagues, the people I was working with were from almost all parts of the world. I mean, there were, I think, of the group that I went through Penn with, this is of no importance to anyone but myself, but it's a way of getting at your question. 5 were Americans, 5 were from Britain, and 5 were from 5 other countries in the world. So, I mean, I sat next to a woman from Colombia in South America. In fact, the learning process, I've argued more recently at Penn, an important part of the learning process was the interaction between students from various parts of the world, grown up in different cultural environments and different views of what landscape architecture was about. So I don't for a moment see, I'm not prepared to identify them. I think there were some major programs in the United States in the 60s that had a kind of, quote, American focus, but I wasn't exposed to that until much later, in fact. So my own experience for, 2 years at Penn was unbelievably rich as a kind of almost global, not quite, but in a sense, a kind of global view of environment, the built environment, and then working with people from a variety of backgrounds and cultures, both on the academic level and as colleagues.
How were you able to transfer that information that you gained in those 2 years to the Canadian scene? Was there any difficulty?
Not without a lot of difficulty. I came back to Canada in '69, having spent some 10 years in the United States, worked in private practice, teaching, and worked in the public sector as well, and just very, very fortunate during that period. And came back to Canada confident that we wouldn't, as a nation, it's terribly presumptuous, but young people are that way.
Thank heavens.
I was convinced that we could get on with things without making some of the disastrous mistakes that had been made in the United States. The northeastern states was the area I knew best. And here I'm speaking less at the project level and more at the not quite regional scale, but larger landscape level, where there were any number of incidents, documentations of incidents where the environment had been, if not poisoned, at least ill-treated. And I came back here absolutely overjoyed that we'd be able to proceed, at least in the prairies, in a way that, and learn from the lessons that, at least as I understood them, of things that had gone wrong and right in parts of the United States. Well, as I'm sure you know, by and large, we all have to make the mistakes ourselves. We don't. I think in retrospect, it is presumptuous to think that you can simply draw lessons from those experiences in another culture, in another political climate, and all of that, and use those lessons immediately in a kind of positive way. So, for the last quarter of a century, my time as head of this program and someone on the teaching staff, and who's been involved in practice a little bit here and in some other parts of the world, the frustration is that it would appear that each culture at each point in history has to run through their own mistakes before you can get on with things. However,
do you think that the kinds of technical skills, the tools that you gained in graduate school, gave you an advantage on that in Canada, or how did that help you?
No, I don't think of the technical skills per se as being, when I look back on it, as not that which I carried away that I think in retrospect was most important. I think what was most important was a whole new view and vision of the built environment, and less the technical details of it. You must understand, I'd left Manitoba as a graduate in architecture who initially saw myself as kind of extending my experience through graduate work in landscape architecture, and fully expected to come back and operate, work in an architectural environment. McCarg changed all that, absolutely and completely. I wouldn't have believed it if anyone had suggested before I went to Penn that I could turn around so completely. And I think McCarg had a similar influence on a lot of other people at the time. Now that's been subsequently, I think, challenged, and some of his positions, I think rightly, have been questioned. But at that time, if seen in context, in the North American context, in fact, the Western world context at that time, I think it was an important contribution, and it had to be made. And McHarg, again, I don't mean to overstate his importance, but I think McHarg's skill with the language, his effectiveness as a communicator, all contributed to what I see as a terribly important message that we'd lost track of as a profession, and in some cases, I think, simply had never even discovered it for some. Anyway,
mm-hmm. Yeah. Was that, you said that the main thing for you was a new vision of the built environment?
Sure.
Was that the, would you like to go now to the founding of the school here, or would you like to speak about your
Just
work?
a couple of other things, because
sure, okay.
if you're helping me remember things that I've forgotten all about. I think even at Penn, for the first year or so, I still didn't realize that I had moved so far from the position that I'd held when I left Canada in '59. I can remember as you probably know, when I completed my program at Penn, I was asked or invited to be a part of a 10-person design team that were responsible for some important work in the city of Boston, mm-hmm. and with perhaps my exception, a really thoroughly outstanding group of designers and planners under the direction of David Crane, who had been teaching in the planning department at Penn, and who then became the design director for the redevelopment program in Boston. But that's neither. It was important to me at the time, I must say, but it simply reminds me. I can remember at some point standing on the upper floor of a tall building in Boston and looking down on the Charles River as a kind of parkland, and thinking to myself, probably for the first time, here was something, an individual had the vision to transform what had been, and subsequently I read it's quoted as a stinking mudflat, into an incredibly rich piece of urban fabric, for me, most importantly, accessible to all sectors in the community. And that there's a part of my background that sees that as important. And I think that's when, at that point, I finally acknowledged that I was most interested in carrying forward in that direction, a direction that had contact with the urban landscape particularly, although I'm also interested in the rural landscape, as you know. Mm-hmm. Now, that's kind of the final, when I think about it now, that's probably the final point, or the point, when much of what I'd been introduced or exposed to, and those who've influenced me, all came together in a way. I can't remember coming down that building thinking, now this is what I'm going to do, but I do remember for the first time realizing this is where I think I can be, I suppose, happiest, but more importantly, where I want to try and make a contribution. Mm-hmm. Now, from there, I was working in the public sector with an incredibly fine group of international designers in Boston for a couple of years. A small group of us broke off from that and ran a program at a smaller city outside Boston, city of Worcester, mm-hmm. About $250,000 or something, I think, at the time, for a couple of years thereafter. Again, what I found interesting there was that working with the public sector, not in the public sector perhaps, but more importantly with the public sector, and with other constituents in the community in shaping or reshaping urban environment in such a way that it was more responsive to the needs of society, if you want to think of it that way at that time. Now, it's when I was in Worcester that I received a call from Dr. Albert Bush Brown. Bush Brown was president of Rhode Island School of Design at that time, and asked if I would consider taking over the chairmanship of the landscape architectural program. It was called the Lowthorpe Department of Landscape Architecture. I must confess that I'd never thought at all about teaching, never in my life at that point. In fact, Bush had introduced himself by saying he'd learned that I was interested in teaching. I've discovered since that's an interesting way of raiding an agency without acknowledging that you're doing the raiding. And if you say, no, I've never thought of that, sir, or Dr. Bush Brown, then the conversation's over. At the time, it sounded, as I said, I hadn't thought about it at all, but indicated that I'd be interested in talking with them. Anyway, long and short of it is, I accepted the position as chairman of the Lowthorpe Department of Landscape Architecture from 65 to 69. It's only then that I began as chair. It had never occurred to me that there are things like accreditation. Discovered the program was on probation, and one of my first tasks was to get it off probation quickly, Rattray. And it was an interesting introduction to the world of education. I carried an office practice, ran an office at that time, at the same time, and in discussion with a couple of heads from other, in fact, major programs in the northeastern states, I can remember we reached some agreement that it really wasn't, for us at least, wasn't possible to chair programs and be senior partners in offices. And I know there are others who've managed to do both, and I have nothing but admiration for them. I found by 69 that, at least for me personally, that I was worried that clients weren't receiving as much direct contact from senior partner in the offices as I would have wanted, and began to worry that the students in the department weren't, that I was having trouble mobilizing the kind of energy that I thought was necessary to do my best in both of those environments. So when I was invited to come to Manitoba and set up what became, although it wasn't when I came here, what became the first graduate program in landscape architecture in Canada, made the decision that I'd step away from professional practice as more or less for a period of initially it was to be about 5 years. Now during that first period of 5 years, I did undertake several projects in Winnipeg, still had some connections with the office, marginally at least, and some other situations in the United States. But for the most part, decided to focus all of my energies, for a while at least, on a new program, one that originally was to be a baccalaureate program here. And when I came up in 69, having reviewed the situation and the context within which that program would be offered, made the recommendation that it ought to be at the graduate level. And in 71, I believe, 71 or 72, the program was formally approved by the provincial government, having gone through a couple of years of review and, I guess a year of work on my part, and then a year of kind of review through the various parts of the system in this university, inter-university committees, and ultimately to the provincial government. Now,
can we just go back a couple of steps on that? And can you tell me how that began? How were you, who contacted you, and how were you invited?
I'd been contacted initially, good point, and it's the connection back to Dean John A. Russell. I'd been contacted in the mid-60s by Dean Russell when I was working in Boston, asking if I would consider a position at the University of Manitoba in the Faculty of Architecture, and he made it clear that they were considering a new department, or a new program at least, in landscape architecture at that time, and I declined the offer. I was so engaged, fully engaged in the work in Boston. I wasn't in a position to think about anything else at that time. Wasn't prepared. In fact, in retrospect, I think wasn't ready to come back to Canada. I needed to be away longer, I think, professionally and personally, I think in all ways. But in any event, declined the invitation then. And then I was contacted again in '68 by, in the meantime, Dean Russell had died, and Roy Sellers had taken over as Dean of the faculty at the University of Manitoba. I was contacted in '68, had some meetings here, and we didn't reach agreement, and I went back to the States. I was very happy chairing the program, and with or without the stress of the office at the same time, at least found it very rewarding. Was approached again early in '69, and again by Dean Sellers, and had some discussions with the senior administration of this university at that time, and agreed to come back in, I think it was July of 1969. Now, there's one other name that I should knit into this, who I owe, and I mean, there are lots, goodness gracious. No one, I mean, all of us have great debts to all kinds of people. I mean, nothing moves forward, it seems to me, of quality unless there's enormous support from a lot of people. And this isn't the time to make all of those acknowledgments, but I think it's important to note Hid Sasaki, who was then chair at the GSD in Boston.
Graduate School of
Yeah,
Design.
yeah. And I learned after I'd been appointed to the position at Rhode Island School of Design that Hid Sasaki had been one of those who apparently had put my name forward. It's interesting because I, at that time, had little contact with him directly. I guess he knew that I was working in Boston with Dave Crane in the group, the Redevelopment Authority. And my understanding is that he and Albert Bush Brown, who was then president at RISD, obviously were known to each other, and that he, I'm told, was one of those who'd encouraged Bush Brown to contact me. I've subsequently had the chance on a number of occasions to talk with him. I wish I could say we were friends. That's not an accurate description of our relationship. He was obviously a few years older, and to me a kind of giant, and not a McCart. I mean, he's obviously a different person and all of that, but equally important, I think. And I watched him operate with students in so-called jury situations or review situations, and found him again, much like John A. Russell, to be one who had this wonderful capacity of drawing the best from others. And there are few people that I've met in the world who have that capacity, and I think it's a wonderful, wonderful quality. I wish I had it. Anyway, Hid, I think, was of influence to me first in that way, that he was such, I think, a fine human being, and his ability to have others work together and create works of quality, I think was important, both at the school and in his office. And then as well, I think at that time, while others would want to argue with it, I think he would have to be seen as one of the more important, or a senior person in one of the more important firms in North America. I don't think there's any question about it. So, you know, I have a continuing and abiding interest in fine project level work. I've not done nearly as much of it as I would have wanted, but I have enormous respect for those who can execute work of high quality. And I think whether it was SWA, Sasaki, Dawson and Associates, whatever, it went under several names, that firm. Sasaki's influence, and others obviously in that firm, demonstrated a standard of professional work that I found to be of major importance. And my understanding of Hide Sasaki's professional and personal qualities, you know, led me to just give him enormous respect as well.
Mm-hmm. So in 1969, whoops, that was great. In 1969, you came to Winnipeg.
Yeah.
Back here to the
Prairies, which is where I'd spent the first 25 years or so of my life, actually. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I came back. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and at that time, then how was you said that initially the program was to be an undergraduate degree. Yeah. What can you give some light? Can you shed some light on the discussions of how that changed?
Weren't many discussions. There were. I must confess, this was in the initial year or so, a dreadfully lonely time for young Rattray. I'll tell you, there were very few others in the city that had landscape architecture. I mean, this is true of anyone who was working at that time, I think, in Canada. And I'm sure you've heard the same sort of story from others. But I'll tell you, it was lonely. It wasn't that in fact, there were, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 others in the city at the time, maybe even a handful. But including might want to stop that just for, including, I think Jim Patterson was here at that time, and Doug Patterson.
Yeah.
Jim Taylor was here at that time. In fact, I had Jim doing some lecturing for me early on. I can't remember whether Gary Hilderman was here or still working in Toronto with project planning at that. I can't remember. Gunter was here, but I didn't know Gunter. I had no contact with Gunter at all at that time. I may be missing 1 or 2 others, but certainly within the university environment. Cam was here. No. Funny, I don't think Cam was here then. I don't know why. Because I'd known Cam as a student. He was a year after me in the architecture program. In fact, I knew him not terribly well, but I knew him as a student. The point, I think, is simply that when I came back, I was dropped into an academic environment which was significantly different as a kind of a large university environment, much different than Rhode Island School of Design had been, with a full range of disciplines and professional areas. And spent all of my time simply trying to understand the dynamics of this place and what would be necessary to be successful in bringing a program together. I frankly had few discussions. There were, and at the time I found it but somewhat difficult. There simply weren't the opportunities to throw out ideas, have them discussed, and all of that. Chap who was then heading environmental studies at the University of Manitoba, the Department of Environmental Studies, the undergraduate program, Carl Nelson, who in fact now is on our staff, was one of a very few that I had a chance to talk with. But by and large, and I don't say this with any pride, but because it runs against my grain, I like to think, but didn't involve as much or embrace as much of the thinking of others as I would have liked at the time. And that was, I'll give you two other names though. And that was simply because I'd not at that point found others that I could work with, felt comfortable with, or that I thought had any understanding of what landscape architecture was about, except for a guy named Robert N. Alsop, A-L-L-S-O-P-P, now partner in Detroit Alsop Hillier in Toronto, and to my mind, just a giant in the field of urban landscape architecture and urban design. Bob was director of planning, campus planning for the University of Manitoba when I came up. And I think we just kind of hit it off rather well. I had respect, I gained respect for him very quickly, and I've carried that with me for the better part of a lifetime. And Bob, it's funny, I hadn't really thought about this. Probably he's the one person that I had a chance to exchange ideas with. And if anyone influenced my thinking or the program as it was shaped in the initial stages, it would have been Bob Alsop. Now, the other person that I communicated with at the time was a young woman named Dr. Jennifer Shea, who a few weeks ago received an honorary membership in a recognition, at least, with CSLA. I think one of Canada's, not just Manitoba, but one of Canada's fine botanists, ecologists, who simply made it her business to get involved with the community. And she remains a good friend and colleague, and has had a major impact on some aspects of the program, not so much the design area, but certainly the natural science. In fact, part of what I brought from Penn, that commitment to natural process as an aspect of landscape architectural practice was first discussed with Jennifer Shea. And then, in fact, Jennifer Walker, subsequently married. She was the first, other than Alsop, she would have been the first person that I contacted in 1969 and made it clear that I wanted to work with her. And I wanted her to work with our program, and she from the beginning then has had some involvement. Anyway, that's another story, but I think that begins to give some indication of the context and the first year or 2 or 3 of the program at Manitoba. We had a lot of trouble getting started here, by the way. I mean, this is things that I'm not sure need be recorded for history, but I found, with the exceptions of Carl Nelson and the dean in our faculty, that there wasn't overwhelming, in fact, it might be described as underwhelming support for a new program and department. And I don't think that was simply my inability to communicate with excitement what it was. I think it was seen more as a threat to others' turf or funding. And beyond the faculty, I ran into the same kinds of difficulties with some of the other disciplines on campus. Terribly disappointing at the time. It was I guess my introduction to university politics and all of that. Anyway, when I think about it now, though, having said all of that, the one person who ultimately was helpful in getting through this maze was a man named John Page, then Father John Page, who was rector of St. Paul's College subsequently. He was in the planning department at Department of City Planning in our university, and introduced and spoke on my behalf, or the program's behalf, I should say, when it went to Senate and whenever it was. He's subsequently passed away, but anyway, but a good friend and supporter. Actually, it turns out a Penn graduate as well when I think about it now, but I hadn't known him then at all. Anyway, that's kind of, I think, gives something of the context and the initial period in the program.
I'm a little unclear as to how it changed from being an undergraduate program to a graduate program.
It never, I mean, I think it was the deans and the late Dean John A. Russell's view that this would be a one-year addition to, I think, what was then a 3-year undergraduate program in baccalaureate program in environmental studies. And the thought was you could, and this sounds, no, never mind what it sounds like. I think some just thought it was a simple matter of tagging on a year at the end, and you could stamp people on the forehead with a B. Land Arch or BLA. Coming out of the northeastern states, I had a somewhat different view of what I thought was necessary as a range of experiences and subject areas to have some command of. So one, saw it as something more than a one-year add-on, and then secondly, within the context of landscape architectural education in North America, I'm not talking about Canada now, I must confess I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about landscape architectural programs in Canada at that time, in fact very little at all, but saw Penn, Berkeley, Harvard, and a couple of other programs as the measure of programs of quality in North America, and it was on. And I'd spent a little bit of time in Britain then as well, so had some exposure to, I think, what would have been seen as one or two of the better programs in Britain, but felt strongly then that we program here that would that in some ways, it sounds presumptuous and pretentious, but would compete with or offer reasonable alternatives to what I saw as the best programs in North America, and that would have been Harvard, Penn, Berkeley, maybe one or two others. Mm-hmm. And to be adding on a year to an undergraduate program, it seemed to me, was a great disservice to the idea of landscape architecture, to the vision of landscape architecture. And really, I worried as well that those graduating with such a one-year add-on simply had no opportunity to make the kind of contribution that I felt they ought to be able to make. Mm-hmm. Now, the other part of it was simply an internal issue, and that was, at that time, I think there was, as I recall it, the Department of Architecture was reconsidering their structure, and it looked like that too would be going to a graduate program. In my view, I suppose as a politician, was that if we didn't proceed with a program which was seen as an equivalent on paper, that we would be seen as a kind of second-rate program. I should say here as well that when I took over the program at Rhode Island School of Design, I was troubled because my sense was the students did not feel that they were equals to their brothers and sisters in the Department of Architecture, and this simply incensed me. I couldn't abide a group that felt, or that communicated for the most part a kind of apology in terms of what they were doing. And my own view was that landscape architecture was so important that there simply wasn't room for that kind of position. And so at Manitoba, I guess part of my experience coming out of the States was that to have done anything other than structured something that was the equivalent of what was then a well-established program in the Department of Architecture, but was transforming itself into a graduate program that if we didn't establish the equivalent to that, that we would be perceived to be a kind of second-rate option. I didn't want that to happen. On that same point, I chose not to apply for membership in the MAA, the Manitoba Association of Architects, or RAIC. I'd been asked to at the time, in fact, before that, when I was in the States, and I'd chosen not to precisely for the reason that when I came back to Canada, I chose to come back to try and make some contribution in the field of landscape architecture. And I didn't, at that point, now it would be different, but at that point did not want to blur the edges. I wanted to make a sharp and clear, I'm not sure it's distinction, but I was trying as best I could to identify myself with and articulate a position about landscape architecture as opposed to architecture, and as something other than a kind of a few extra courses tagged on the end of an architecture program, by the way. Anyway.
How lucky we are that you had that perspective too. I think it's very fortunate.
At that, I mean, things go through cycles. I think now, for some, and I think here, having established ourselves as a department that has a sense of identity, and in fact, some would argue a very strong sense of identity, some would argue the strongest in our faculty, that it's much easier, I think, to relax a bit, and I think we want to, some have argued, and I would be hard-pressed not to share this view, to blur the edges maybe is important now. I mean, the hard edges between architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, I'm not sure terribly useful anymore. But 25 years ago, I felt it was absolutely essential that we have the time and space to create our own sense of identity. And once that was done, hopefully, then we'd be in a position to begin to blur edges again. And maybe that's where we are now.
Mm-hmm. What did you use at that time as a basis for your curriculum development?
Oh, as model, probably much of what I'd been exposed to at Penn. Clearly, I mean, I'd inherited a curriculum or a program of study at Rhode Island School of Design, had made some adjustments to it, goes without saying, but that too. And then I guess the third one would have been probably Harvard's program at GSD. I mean, I had such respect for HID and some of the others, Chuck Harris, who'd been there, I think, just after him, and some of the others, that in terms of educators and those involved in shaping and adjusting programs, that those probably would have been the three key points. We saw, I think the vision then was, or what we envisioned was, a program which focused on what we would call project level design, but which had at least three legs that design component stood on: the social sciences and the social and natural sciences, technology, and history theory. And those were seen as, at least as I envisioned it, as kind of the three foundations or bases for form making. And then we talked about it then and continue to talk about the studio, the design studio, as the environment for the testing of some of those theories and concepts, and all coming out of social and natural sciences, technology, and history theory. And yeah.
And how much allowance was made for the fact that this program was happening in Canada?
From the outset, we saw our laboratory, if you want to think of it that way, as the prairies. That, I mean, I felt very strongly that we should be not only in the natural science, but obviously in technology and in other areas as well, that we would use the prairie as our lab. Now, that I think from the outset was absolutely fundamental. But rightly or wrongly, Rattray then and now saw the opportunities and need for a program that could speak to students at an international level. So, and I mean, it's for others to judge whether we've been successful at that or not, but we have used the prairies as our lab for studio, for plant materials, for or natural science and all of that. But have drawn, as I'm sure you're aware, students from a number of parts of the world, and they are an important part of our program. I mean, having gone through Penn and been exposed to students from other cultures and all of that, that was important to me and remains important to me at almost, not at any cost, but it is terribly important that the program can still speak to and can engage students from other parts of the world. And for those, they can still use the prairie as lab, but then obviously they have to make some adjustments to other environments as they move back into other parts of either Canada or North America or the world, and they've done all of that, and I must say. So,
what are the advantages to Canadians to be educated in landscape architecture in Canada? What would be wrong with the students who would be here of being educated at Penn and Harvard and Berkeley and other places too? Why do we need a school in Winnipeg?
Well, turn that off for me. But give me the question again as you want it.
Why do we need a program of study in landscape architecture in Canada?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I can speak for Canada. I can speak for this part of Canada and the Prairie region. And I think this is for those who believe, as I do, that sense of place is important and that is a fundamental part of, or aspect to form making, not to have a program somewhere in the prairie environment, it seemed to be, would not allow a part of Canada and the people of that part of Canada to have an opportunity to shape an environment which is appropriate for their time and place, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, I think there are other reasons why, and I can't speak for other parts of Canada. Another reason for the program at Manitoba, which I think was important and remains important, is that this is, I think, the only university environment in Canada which has interior design, planning, architecture and landscape architecture, and something we now call environmental design, all housed within one unit. Now, that's the potential for that, it seems to me, is absolutely phenomenal. We've still not, I think, realized the full potential of that of that structure. And it isn't, I'm not trying to say that this is the only way or anything else, but it is, I believe it's unique in Canada. It's one of only 2 or 3 or 4, I think, situations in North America. And it means that potentially we have, now that we have a sense of identity and all, that we can work, I think, closely with the full gamut of those involved in the built environment, from, at the one hand, the regional scale planning, landscape allocations and all of that, through to, at the interior level, those that are working within, obviously at another scale entirely. So I guess my answer would embrace, or is really in 2 parts. One, the prairie region is a special, I think, important place. Others, it doesn't matter what other, in this case, I think some others may see it differently. Mm-hmm. But it has its own sense of place, and it's deserving that I think that there be a program in landscape architecture that attempts at least to deal with some of that. And the staff here, I think, are sensitive to this, by the way. And then secondly, that it allows for landscape architecture to be offered within a family of units that are all dealing with the built environment. I think that's there are some exciting potentials and opportunities there as well.
You've certainly given me a very good overview of the program, the development of the program here. Are there any other things you'd like to add with regard to the development?
Only one, and or one that comes to mind. I alluded to it or spoke briefly about it before, but just to reiterate, clearly no program comes into being and is maintained without the kind of nurturing and support and help of an awful lot of people. And that ranges from, sometimes, if you're very fortunate, university presidents, people in the community generally, and others in the academic environment. And we've been, and I personally have been, enormously fortunate in having the support of people, a wide range. Many from outside the field of landscape architecture, by the way, but have been helpful in ways that I could never identify effectively, I think. And then the last thing, obviously, is what the programs are all about, and that is the students. I mean, if you're not able to attract students of quality, you simply can't have programs of quality. It's as simple as that. And we've, as I'm sure other programs would believe, we've been blessed with some very fine people along the way, and students just now beginning to make an impact. In fact, I mean, what a program that's almost 25 years old now. Graduates that of a decade and more ago that are now, the last 10 or 15 years, that are just now beginning to find themselves in positions of influence. And I think it's an exciting time, by the way, for those of us who've been involved with the students over the last 2 decades and more. Anyway, that would be the last point, I think, that's important for me, at least, in terms of the development of the program.
Would you speak briefly, please, about some of the other kinds of influence that you have had on the profession of landscape architecture, but on a more international scene?
Yeah, it's not for me to assess whether it's been influential or not. I can speak, though, to the things that have given me joy or pleasure, or that I've found rewarding or whatever. And there's several things come to mind. I think clearly the work in Australia. I mean, that I just, I seem to have been so fortunate in been drawn into a range of situations in various parts of the world, and I found it exciting. The work in Australia, initially through George Seddon, the dean at the University of Melbourne, who asked if I would join them in 82 for a period of time, was led in 84 to an involvement with the I can't remember. I think it was Ministry for Housing and Development or something.
Ministry for Planning and the Environment.
Planning and the Environment, and the establishment of a small interdisciplinary group called the Townscape Advisory Service for the state of Victoria, which was an absolute joy for me to be able to be a part of a group from architecture, landscape architecture, planning, marketing, a number of other disciplines, to begin to work with all centres in the state of Victoria outside Melbourne and give some advice and comment on adjustments to the physical environment and all, and the understanding or the relationship of that to community identity, to health and well-being in other ways, economically in other ways, was really exciting for me. And then to be invited back, in fact, a third time in 88, to do more work, not in Melbourne, but in a region east of Melbourne, but through that same group.
The project in...
in Australia, yes.
The Latrobe, I guess.
Yeah. That that whole experience in Australia was most rewarding for me. At the same time, it was during that time as well, it must have been 82, I guess, when we put together their first overview exhibition of landscape architectural work in Australia, following on the experiences I'd had here where we'd put together that landscape in the 70s for CSLI. The one in Australia, again working with students, was really quite extraordinary. The response was just phenomenal. It circulated to all parts of the country, and I'd like to think had some impact on Australia's understanding and view of the importance of landscape architecture. So now, other things I'm trying to think. I guess my experiences in the other one that comes to mind just immediately that I see as particularly rewarding was my work with in the People's Republic of China in Chongqing. Chongqing Institute of Architecture and Engineering. Went over, and as you probably know, in '87 as an instructor with a group of 9 staff members, as graduate students from the University of Manitoba, working with students from Chongqing as well. I'll stop there for a minute. That may not be on the form.
It is here somewhere. I read it, yes. Okay, continue.
And then following that 3-month or so experience in '87, where I had a chance to work not only with their students, but with staff at that institution and with the president, who was just a fine, fine individual, was invited back in '88. My wife and I, we worked again with graduate students. There were no students from Manitoba at that time. Bless you, my child. And a shorter period of time, but again, as I think you are aware, I'd been appointed advisory professor at Chongqing Institute of Architecture and Engineering. I didn't find out until a year after it had happened that this was a national award that had been recognized by the national government at that time. And I just found the people there to be so responsive and so kind and generous to both me and to my wife that it stands out in my mind as an important experience. Now, I was asked to go back again for a full year in '89 and wasn't able to do that. But we've been asked, we're now exploring the possibility of going back actually into another university elsewhere in China, but there's some possibility we'll be back there again. I'd like to do it. I've found at this point to be able to share some of the experiences from this part of the world with other parts of the world, and to learn from those in other parts of the world is really important for me, and I'd like to be able to bring that back to students in Canada as well. I think there's some important things going on, by the way, in the People's Republic of China, in parts of Africa, I don't know them quite as well, other parts of Southeast Asia, that programs young people in Canada and the United States ought to hear about. And I'm afraid they're not hearing as much as they should. I think there are lessons to be learned that are going to be critically important as we move into the 21st century in terms of the way they are dealing with some of their problems in the built environment and notions of energy efficiency, self-sustaining communities, and all of that. And in some ways, in many cases, in very modest ways, but nonetheless important ways, I think they're doing things that we should be more aware of. Anyway.
I think that you would be in a very good position to be of assistance in that kind of situation, because that's very similar to what you've done here, really. You were educated somewhere else, and you've applied that knowledge to Canada, and the knowledge you've gained here, you can very easily transfer to yet another cultural scene.
I hope so. My wife and I, as you perhaps are aware, my wife's a landscape architect and artist, and originally from Italy, and all of her formal training in Italy. And I think together, if we had the chance to work with people in other institutions, even developing programs in other parts of the world. Now, I'm talking about developing programs, not I think, I know we'd both find it rewarding. So that may be something that we might have a chance to think more about in the next period of time.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we could speak for a few moments. You've kind of indicated a few thoughts there on it. What's your ideas of the future of landscape architecture is in Canada, and perhaps you might also like to suggest what you think the future of it is in terms of the world. Where do you see landscape architecture going? What do you see landscape architects doing? Do you see any kind of changes from how it's been to how it might be?
Oh, there must be some changes. There must be some changes. But when you ask about Canada, I know I should be carrying a torch in a way, or a flag or something, and I find it increasingly difficult not to be viewing things at a level that goes beyond political boundaries. That's not to say that I mean, there's some important things I think about being Canadian, and more importantly, maybe the regional qualities within parts of Canada that I mean, that also is important to me. But the views, it seems to me, must transcend political boundaries now. I mean, the natural systems don't work that way, and we all know it. So, in terms of the future and where we're at now, clearly, I mean, it's almost old hat and sounds tiresome, but we still, I think, have not, as a profession, found a way of integrating and recognizing, respecting natural systems and their effect on form making in the urban environment and beyond. And we just have to do it. I mean, or we're going to go the way of the dodo. I mean, the academic programs have some responsibility for this, clearly have responsibility for this. The profession itself, as a profession, has a responsibility for this. And I mean, we all know the difficulties. We're all stretched, and you can only go so long on, 18-hour days or something. And it's true. And at some point, you can't do all the things you would want to do as a profession. I'm not talking now personally, but as a profession or as an institution academically. But we need to explore further ways of integrating natural process, I believe, and form making. But for me, that's something quite different than scattering seeds on the ground and calling it landscape architecture. I mean, that's not my view of landscape architecture at all. It is really, and there is intention and meaning to it, our form making. And so it must, for me, go beyond simply replicating nature or what we saw as the 18th century English Romantic landscape, which I was wonderful in its time and place and context, but I find it wearying that we've found it necessary, for the most part, to hang on to this for dear life as a profession even into the latter part of the 20th century. And there, I think we're running into problems. I mean, I know, and you know, there are landscape architects in Canada furious, and in other parts of the Western world, including major parts of Western Europe, landscape architects furious that major commissions are going to those that don't carry, are not card-carrying members of the profession of landscape architecture. In the 1970s, I spoke at this, obviously not very effectively, at a group at one of the universities in the United States. In fact, it would have been the 60s now that I think of it. And it troubled me no end then that the profession was still hanging on to this, what to me appeared to be a kind of 18th century English Romantic landscape, but in a new context, political, economic, social, and all the rest of it. And for someone who believes there's some relationship between process and form, I couldn't comprehend how we couldn't move beyond that. Now, I think people like Schwartz, Van Valkenburg, you name them, there are a number, but interestingly enough, two key women in this, including Tori Winkler is another one, I think have challenged the profession in a way that's critically important. And I've spoken about this with our own students here for several years now. Whatever you think about the work of somebody like Martha Schwartz, I think what she has done is forced the profession to reassess what it's about. And I think, and thank goodness for that. So the future for the profession, it seems to me, whether it's in Canada, the United States, or elsewhere on this funny little globe of ours, is going to be one that somehow finds a way of accommodating, of recognizing, acknowledging, and working with natural systems in a way that some will, I mean, landscape architects say, well, of course, we've always been doing this. Well, folks, it just isn't true. We're not. Some are, some aren't. We're going to have to do more of it, and we're going to have to do it better. That affects both the educational programs and I think the profession as well. But coupled with that, then, I think we've got to find a way. There is this quest for an expression which is appropriate to our time, which says something about, well, clearly has something to do with the sense of a particular place. That's one layer, but some of the other layers, which says something about culture in the late 20th, moving into the 21st century, and the values that are a part of that, and the needs and wants of people at this point in our history. And I'm afraid that landscape architecture profession generally has been slow to respond to these challenges. Now, maybe the finger has to be pointed back to the institutions for not, like our program here, that we're not doing enough to help people in their quest for an expression, physical form expression, which is appropriate to these times. But wherever the finger is pointed, I think is one thing. What's more important is acknowledging that we've simply got to get on with it. And again, that transcends obviously political boundaries. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you give some specific examples of that? Of how you
of works that begin to do this? Not a lot. I mean, I tend to use the examples. I mean, I think I've said it. Schwartz's work, beginning with Bagel Garden, if not earlier, and Tori Winkler's work, that project, that rural or that residential garden that was on the front cover of a ladies' magazine sometime in the 70s. Wonderful piece of work. I think were important in beginning to shake the profession, and I think it has to be shaken further, frankly. More recently, and these are not going to be popular things with many of my colleagues, but I think some of the work, things like La Valette in Paris is an important departure, and some of my closest colleagues would be terribly disappointed to have me say this, but I believe it. I think Tsumi's work, Chematov's work, some of the others working in Paris are terribly important, and we'll see. History will tell whether I've misread things or not, but I think they're important. They don't begin to address all of the issues I've just spoken about as criteria for work of quality in the future, but I think they at least begin to address the issue of a meaning or an expression of our time, and that's important. Some of the work that's being done by OMA, Office of Metropolitan Architecture, and Rem Koolhaas and whatnot, is another, some of their runners-up work in Paris and elsewhere in the Netherlands, I think, is of major importance. And in America, at the moment, I would see Van Valkenburg as one of those who I think begins to incorporate, we'll see, but for me, I think he may be the one who will find a way of pulling all of this together, that it is a kind of, I don't like to use the word man-made, but person-made doesn't sound right, but a kind of intended constructed environment, which isn't trying to replicate or mimic landscapes of the past, but at the same time beginning to knit in concepts of sustainability, of natural systems, which I think have to be incorporated as well. Now, the other individual, and again, it's not a landscape architect in the traditional sense of the word, and my colleagues again won't be happy with it. I would suggest that at this point, perhaps another of the most important projects of the late 20th century has to be Maya Lin's Vietnamese Veterans Memorial in Washington. I mean, the power of that statement, the meaning that that embodies is, I don't know of any landscape architect in America that's kind of card-carrying member of the profession that has been as successful in the latter part of this century as Maya Lin in bringing or imbuing meaning to an intervention in the urban environment. Now,
how about in Canada?
Yeah, I'm struggling here. If I were to put my list of top 10s or something together, I have to go back. It probably bridges a much broader time period than others might want to think about, and as it turns out, I believe a number of those projects that have been most significant in terms of what we now call landscape architecture were not executed by landscape architects at all. I'd have to say that one of those interventions into natural systems, Western Canada at least, which has had probably more impact than any other single event, was that thing called the grid. I mean, that has affected the physical landscape, the psychological landscape, and the sense of being of individuals psychologically in a way that unbelievably powerful. It's just, it's almost beyond comprehension for me. And I mean, it's been very popular to knock the grid as something which was kind of evil and was not respectful of the natural environment. But having said that, I think it still has had a major impact, clearly, and not always negative, on a prairie environment. Moving into works. Oh, and the other very early example that I think is important in Canada is the first of our national parks, or what became the first of our national parks, Banff. And the point there is that a government and a country saw the importance of part of its natural resource, important enough that they wanted to protect it. Now, you know, and I know that it had already been done in the United States, I think a few years before, if I got my dates right. But nonetheless, that a nation would make the decision that part of their landscape was important enough to preserve for all time, whether it's been done successfully or not, another thing, is, I think, an important milestone in a nation, in a way. Now, if I move forward, then the next kind of, and I'd go to Western Canada, and someone who has been, I think, much maligned, but if we're going to talk about the age of outside experts, which happens across Canada at some point or another, I'd put Thomas H. Mawson in, and his work at Wascana Centre particularly. Now, he did work, and landscape architects in Eastern Canada have dismissed all this, but he did work at Dalhousie, right through to the West Coast proposals. And he represents that period of outside experts that includes the Olmsted and then the Olmsted brothers, Todd, and others. But I think I'd put Mawson in there as an important, in the work at Wascana Centre. I mean, it is, I think, of major importance in Western Canada, that project. Now, if I take the next step forward in history in terms of Canada, I'm missing, I don't know the Southern Ontario in that early period, and I'm embarrassed to say it's simply ignorance on my part. Austin Floyd, I want to do more work on him. I don't have the information. I can't speak knowledgeably about that period. And the other thing I'd say is that if I had to put aside, I mean, if I were talking about a top 10 or something, the area I know least about, even less than Southern Ontario, would be Quebec. And I should know more about it. I've got to do more work on it now. One of the, I'm jumping ahead in history, but I think another major intervention that has had impact on Canada of major significance would be the Expo 67. And my guess is that not many people would see it that way. When I reflect on it, though, that was a project, not just for Quebecers, but I think for Canadians, where and that's a piece of urban landscape in a way, where they were drawn together and there was a sense of identity that I don't think had happened before. I'd be interesting to talk with you or others about it, but I'd put that on my list. I know several of the landscape architects who were involved in that. I know it went beyond landscape architecture, but I'd put it on my list as a project of importance. Now, in terms of one other area, and I'm torn between Mac Hancock's work and that residential project in the Toronto area and Wildwood Park in Winnipeg. Wildwood has to be seen as, I think, the model for that, the old kind of Radburn plan in Canada, probably the best example of that. And I'm now trying to sort out which one, whether it's Mac Hancock's work or the work that was done in Wildwood Park in Winnipeg, I'd rank as the most important in terms of kind of post-war residential environment and a new view of and understanding and the importance of quality in the residential environment. But it seems to me those two fall in there. Now, for all of us, I mean, I'm probably missing all kinds of important things. In the Atlantic provinces, I've spent some time there. I can't identify projects right now that I would put in that list. Of the contemporary works, more contemporary works, I'd put National Capital Commission's Confederation Boulevard on the list of projects. Because that, again, has a kind of national impact in a way. And it represents a lot of input, and it's interesting when I think about it. Quite almost surprisingly, it embraces work by a number. I mean, again, it isn't one landscape architect, capital L, capital A, marching off to his own tune. It involved a dialogue between some people of vision within the National Capital Commission, the office of Dutoit-Alsop-Hilliard, but a number of other offices as well. And I put that in terms of process and as an idea as high on my list of important projects for Canada. I was trying to think, I had one or two others, and one of the other projects, and again, it's going to offend my colleagues, but I'm going to say it anyway, and that's the CCA Gardens, Sculptor Gardens in Montreal, Charney's project for the Canadian, Center for Canadian Architecture. Phyllis Lambert's the name I was trying to think of. Charney's project for her, I think, is one of those projects of the late 20th century that places us on kind of the international map in a way. I wish there were more of them. I can't think of many others. Now, having said that, and I think it's important, at least for me, to acknowledge that it isn't just good work. There is some good work in Canada, but great work has to be a coming together of a kind of a design will and skill and competence, a political will, the financial means, and a number of other things all have to come together at one moment in time and come together almost perfectly, or you don't end up with great work. Now, sometimes that's done only with great pain, and I know the Vietnamese Veterans Memorial in Washington is a pretty good example of that. But still, all the pieces were there, and however difficult it was, came together in such a way that could happen. Now, Canada as a country, I mean, one, it's young. Two, at least in the traditional sense, the climatically is not as not all of Canada, but parts of Canada. It's probably more difficult to achieve some of these things. In that respect, when I think about it, we really haven't, as a profession, addressed the winter landscape in a way, and that's appalling. And I speak critically on that for myself, my colleagues, our program, but other programs in Canada. We simply don't. I mean, and it's something that has to be addressed. Anyway, I don't know how many that puts on the list, and there aren't nearly as many contemporary examples as I would like to speak to. I'm sorry that I can't think of, and as you know, Michael Huff and I go back a long, long way, and I have enormous respect for his early work and some of his newer thinking and the way that he's pursuing things now. But I can't think of one individual project that, back to your question, that I'd place in that category. But I think he's one who's made a significant contribution professionally. How many did we get on the list, young lady?
We've got quite a few there. We can continue that, though, in other discussions as well, if you like. I would like to ask you, just before we run out of tape, though, however, you've mentioned a couple of times something that you've said in expression was sort of your vision of landscape architecture and something that fits in or that doesn't fit in. And the expression you've said is my vision of landscape architecture. What is your vision of landscape architecture?
Well, I tried, I guess, to address it when I was talking about, or aspects of it in talking about natural process and humankind's, the need for humankind to make marks. I think we must make marks. And the vision for me is then, but that's kind of a side. The vision is, I mean, this is the discipline. It must be the discipline that can gather all, I mean, it's so exciting, that can gather all of these various parts and pieces, that can bring to one table the natural sciences, the social sciences, those involved in technology, and others, and as well as we move into the 21st century, find a way of, it isn't just accommodating, of bringing in as a part of that gathering process, those constituents, not just client, but the constituents that are going to experience the environments that we want to help to shape, and together then to give form to an environment which is more responsive to the needs of individuals now, more expressive of place, and obviously expressive as well of the technologies of our time and all of that. And that applies not only for Canada and that is North America, but it seems to me that the opportunities now are really more than they've ever been in history, I suppose, global opportunities. And I think we've got to spend some time there as well.